welcome to this Bright Blue panel event on ensuring greater and greener housing. Thank you very much. There's a lot of excitement in the room. My name is Alexandra Jezeph. I'm on the board of Bright Blue, an independent think tank and pressure group for liberal conservatism. We have 7 major research themes: bountiful economy, clean environment, good lives, rewarding work, empowering government, just institutions and connected communities. In hosting today's event, we are very pleased to be partnering with the European Climate Foundation.
Could you speak up, please?
Yes, of course.
Are these working?
No.
Testing.
The microphones are not working.
The microphone is just for the live stream, I'm afraid.
Okay, no problem. If you are, I'll speak even louder then. If you're on Twitter, please do use hashtag BrightBlue and hashtag CPC22. And the Twitter handle is @WeAreBrightBlue. A quick reminder to our in-person audience that we are being recorded today and live streamed on the Bright Blue YouTube channel. So to our online audience, a warm welcome, and please do send your questions into us via Slido. There is an urgent need for the real estate sector to accelerate its response to the challenge of decarbonisation. 21% of all carbon emissions in the UK come from our homes, and at the global level, the real estate sector is estimated to be responsible for 40% of carbon dioxide emissions. As the UK housing supply crisis continues, how do we strive to deliver new net zero homes without significantly compromising on housing affordability? And given that 2/3 of our global real estate footprint today will still be around in 2040, is there enough focus on the urgent need to retrofit our existing homes, as well as awareness of the sheer scale of this task? There's an enormous amount to discuss when it comes to decarbonising our homes, ranging from MMC off-site construction in delivering new housing, biodiversity net gain and the impact that this could have for our natural environment, through to improving EPC ratings for our existing housing stock. This evening's debate will examine the sustainability challenge faced in all aspects of our housing market and look at where change is most urgently needed. We've asked our panellists to consider a number of questions. I won't read them all out, but a few to highlight would be: how can planning regulations or design codes be improved to build both affordable and sustainable homes? Can the government's boiler upgrade scheme succeed where other public policies to incentivise energy efficiency measures have failed? And how can we encourage consumers to make environmentally friendly choices when renovating or upgrading their houses? And we're delighted to have no less than 7 panellists joining us to debate these important questions.
They all said yes.
We're delighted. Ruth Edwards MP is Conservative MP for Rushcliffe. We have Brian Berry, who is Chief Executive of the Federation of Master Builders. Nicholas Boys-Smith is Founding Director of Create Streets and was the co-chair of the government's Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission. Martina Lees is a senior property writer at The Times and The Sunday Times and author of The Accidental Landlord. Dr. Samuel Hughes is a research fellow at the University of Oxford and a senior fellow at Policy Exchange. We also have Liam Halligan, who is economics and business editor at GB News, and James Cullimore, who is senior nature programme manager at the Conservative Environment Network. And I should add, author of a forthcoming Bright Blue report on getting more homes ready for net zero, so keep an eye out for that. So a warm welcome to all our speakers. We've got an hour and a quarter to cover a very hot topic. I will ask my guests to keep their opening remarks to 5 minutes, particularly as there's a few of us, and I'll invite Ruth to start. Thank you very much.
Alexandra, thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be with you here this evening. There is almost no other subject on earth more likely to cause Conservative MPs to don their armour and line up battalion style for battle than the issue of housing and planning. You can always tell what is concerning the Parliamentary Conservative Party by the amount of traffic that there is on WhatsApp about the issue. Planning Concern has its own WhatsApp group, which should give an indication as to just how concerned about the issues colleagues are. And Concern has sort of fluctuated somewhat between on fire and somewhat hysterical when the white paper and zonal planning came out, down to far less concerned when Michael Gove took over and we had some very sensible forms in the current levelling up bill, and it's somewhere sort of seesawing somewhere in between as we wait for more detail on some of the top level planning announcements that have been sort of just very briefly alluded to in the last couple of weeks. And I think I can probably best contribute to this discussion from my position as a constituency MP. And there are just sort of two things I want to highlight at the opening. The first being that the planning system has lost its legitimacy with the public and it's not delivering what we need. And the second one, that we should be doing a lot more to build greener homes. And that, again, is feedback I get from constituents on a regular basis. So in terms of the planning system, in Rushcliffe, I think I could sum up how people feel about it by saying they feel under siege from developments at the moment. It's not that they think that we shouldn't have new houses. Of course, we need to build new houses, but they do feel that their voices are being ignored by the planning system. They feel the character of their communities and their particularly the rural communities in Rushcliffe are being changed beyond recognition, and that's a really important part of the biodiversity discussion. And I think they also feel there is an unsustainable level of housing that is being built, particularly in terms of local infrastructure. We have new homes registered there way above what the constituency average for new home registrations is for the last 3 years. We have issues in villages with the sewerage system, which can't take the increased runoff. And again, looking at how we solve that with development is a key issue. We have a health centre, which is far too small for the number of practitioners it currently needs. People feel developers don't pay enough towards infrastructure. They feel that they are able to land bank to buy land and not build on it. And the current way of doing things just does not have the confidence of the public anymore. So reforms to the infrastructure levy, commencement notices, strengthening local and neighbourhood plans in the Levelling Up Bill are absolutely vital. And we also need the Prime Minister to deliver on her promise to end top-down housing targets. They should be set locally according to need. Now, in terms of building greener homes, given our net zero commitments, it's daft to be building any homes now that we will need to retrofit. We still are, we still will be until about 2025. Now, obviously, a lot of work has been done in terms of the new home standards, the new building standards, but we could do more. Why are solar panels, for example, not mandated on the roofs of all new builds, but yet we are perfectly happy to carpet the green fields of the countryside with them? That is an absolute mystery to my constituents. It's a mystery to me and clearly a mystery to many of you in the room as well. I'd also like to see us doing a lot more to improve energy efficiency of existing homes. The government's got a really strong record in many areas of environmental policy. We decarbonise faster than any other G20 country, but it does vary very much by sector, and 67% of homes in this country still have an EPC of less than C. That is not an area where I think we have done as well as we could in the last few years. So I work with a think tank called Onward, if I'm allowed to mention that here, I apologise. But we believe in market competition as Conservatives. So I've been working with Onwards on some ideas for how we could help make things like decarbonising homes much more affordable for people. Stamp duty rebate, obviously cutting taxes is extremely en vogue at the moment. We think offering a stamp duty rebate for people installing energy efficiency measures on low carbon heating systems, for example, within 24 months of purchasing a property is a really good idea. Demand aggregation. It's worked really well for community broadband vouchers. It could also work really well for example, low carbon heat systems. So this would allow new customers and areas to register their interests for a new technology and then going out to get a bid from different providers. And then the final idea I want to just chuck in the pot is looking at salary sacrifice schemes for green technologies. So it's worked very well for Cycle to Work. Employees obviously sacrifice a portion of their salary every month over a defined period. They pay less tax and national insurance on their remaining salary, and they save up to 40% on the item they're sacrificing it for. So obviously it's been done for bikes. Why aren't we doing it for heat pumps, rooftop solar? Employers can purchase outright for a nominal fee at the end of the scheme. So I think there are lots of good ideas out there, and I'm really interested to hear what comes out from fellow panellists.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ruth, there. So a couple of comments there on the call for greener homes, the sustainability of development and the need for local infrastructure, and a selection of new ideas, which I'm sure we can debate. Brian.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you for the invitation to be here this evening. It's really great to be part of this discussion. So just to explain about the Federation of Master Builders, we are a trade association for small and micro building companies, the typical building firm you would find in any village or town. So 85% of my members are engaged in repair and maintenance work, 15% are in house building. But when I say house building, they're building a few houses a year, up to about 6, so they're micro house builders. So tonight's very interesting because we're talking about greater and greener housing. So in terms of the greater bit, I'd like to address the supply of housing, because in this country we've got a very rich and varied housing stock. It's built up the heritage of this country. And until relatively recently, of course, most of those homes were built by local house builders, which is why we've got that fantastic heritage. But sadly, over the last 40 years, there's been a marked decline in local house builders. 40 years ago, 40% of all new homes were built by SMEs. That has now dropped to 10%. And that's, I think, has problems and concerns all around, because consumers have less choice in terms of the type of house they want to have. There's issues about design, of course, and there's the accusations of identical housing across the country. And, of course, local house builders are based in their regional communities, employing local people. 71% of all apprentices are trained by SMEs. So the decline of the local house builder has an impact on regional economic growth. We carry out an annual survey of our members to find out what's happening, and they say actually access to land is the number one issue. Last year, 63% of my members said actually they found it difficult to find the very small parcels of land that they would find attractive to build on. The planning system, as you've touched on, is complicated and burdensome for a lot of small local house builders. They don't have the resources of the large house builders to talk to the planning departments. And of course, there is concern about the resourcing of local planning departments, because the slowdown in the processing of applications means extra time, which means extra money for local house builders. And then you add on to that the problems about skill shortages in the building industry, which existed before the pandemic, but over the last couple of years have just got worse. 45% of my members are struggling to recruit carpenters, 40% are struggling with bricklayers. We need to develop more homegrown talent. And then you add on material shortages, which have been a major concern over the last couple of years. So we need to think about ways of actually ensuring that actually those issues are tackled by the government and we have greater choice. But the other issue in terms of greening our homes is our existing housing stock. 39% of our homes were built before 1939, and we've got the oldest and leakiest housing stock in Europe. And what's the challenge there is that 85% of the existing homes will still be with us in 2050. So if there is a commitment to reduce carbon emissions, we need to make our existing housing stock more energy efficient and greener. Now, that's a fantastic opportunity for small builders, or it should be, because we know from a report we did from Oxford University in 2008 that the retrofit market for making our homes greener is worth between £3.5 and £6.5 billion a year. But unfortunately, we haven't got it right in terms of policy. Over recent years, we've had the Green Deal come and go, and last year we had the Green Homes Grant Scheme. And the problem with this piecemeal approach is that actually it gives a lack of certainty to small builders wanting to invest. And over the last couple of years, there's been so much work as people wanted to extend their homes or improve their gardens that actually builders have put their focus on home extensions rather than on retrofit. So the industry has worked together. The F&B has been leading the Construction Leadership Council on developing a long-term plan, a national retrofit strategy. And this would take 20 years, but actually this would transform our 29 million homes. But it does need to be joined up. And I think rather than just putting fiscal incentives in, you need to look at the key elements. So there needs to be better information for consumers. And each home should have a building passport so that actually you don't need to do all the work in one go, that you can actually do it in a staged approach. There should be financial incentives in the terms of reduced stamp duty or council tax for improvements that you do to your home. There also needs to be upskilling in the building industry to make sure there are competent installers to do the work. In this country, anyone can call themselves a builder, so there's a real concern about the quality of the work. And then standards, we need to make sure that all the work is done to the right standard. And of course, the big benefit of retrofit is it's spread all across the country. It would bring jobs in every constituency. And research we've done this year with the IPPR has shown that actually jobs in the northern constituencies would increase by 14%. So a very good stimulus job creation for those northern constituencies. So my parting shot is, yes, we need greater housing, but we need more diverse housing with more SMEs and local house builders to be part of the solution. And we need a joined up approach to tackle our existing housing stock and stop the piecemeal approach that we've seen to date. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ryan. So a call there for skills, access to land, the national retrofit strategy. I like the idea of building passports and increasing standards. So next, I think we have Nicholas.
Well, there was going to be Martina, but I'm very happy to go next.
Oh, sorry, Martina. Sorry, yes, yeah. Apologies.
Well, people are angry. We are being hit hardest at home with soaring mortgage costs, rent, and energy bills. From this weekend, we are all paying more than ever for our energy, almost double what we paid last year, despite the Prime Minister's price guarantee. Britain's homes are, as Brian said, among the oldest and worst performing in Europe. And for decades, that problem has been too hot to handle. But now it is too hot not to handle. But still, the government is basically ignoring it. It is doing almost nothing to insulate our homes. We will spend £100 billion on the energy price freeze. £100 billion is enough. Well, that's more than what we spend on furlough. It is enough to pay for 5 nuclear power stations. But we will literally burn all that money. It's mad. Why don't we invest some of it in fixing our homes? It will cut everybody's energy bill permanently. To insulate every loft and cavity wall that needs it would cost about £12.5 billion. That would save almost £4 billion every year in energy bills, enough to pay for itself within 3 years. There is no better way to wean us off Putin's gas. Producing more gas in Britain will do almost nothing to cut household bills because gas prices are set in global markets. 4% of our gas came from Russia. We can eliminate that 4% in just 1 year if we started a program to make every home in Britain as energy efficient as possible. That's what the think tank E3G says. Sorry. They also say a program like that would sustain 0.75% economic growth and up to 300,000 jobs to 2040. Without a green homes program, we won't hit net zero emissions by 2050, and if the world misses that target, we face catastrophic climate change in our lifetime. And this is a new study that says in 30 years, London will feel like Barcelona. So, what should be done? First, funding. Right now, only the poorest families can get grants to insulate their homes. And only 90,000 homes can get £5,000 each to replace their boiler with a heat pump. That's a drop in the bucket. Over 24 million homes with gas or oil boilers need clean heating. A new study for Nationwide, the lender, drew up a blueprint to reach net zero homes. It says urgent and serious government intervention is essential. Increased grant funding should target those homes that are easiest to address, and that will build economies of scale and drive down prices so that no home will be left behind. Secondly, we need to mandate low carbon homes in trigger point regulations when you let, when you sell, and when you renovate, and in planning and building rules. It costs 5 times more to retrofit a house than to build it properly in the first place. But last year, only 2% of new homes built had the top energy rating of A. Since 2015, we've built 1.5 million homes we will need to retrofit. Low carbon design should be exempt from the normal planning red tape. But the opposite is true. And I'll fill you in on my own situation. I live with my young family in a tiny little bungalow with 0 insulation. Draft proofing is duct tape on the windows. And we are trying to knock it down and build an eco home in its place. And the new house will be flood-proof, where the old one is at major flood risk. It will be super insulated, and it will generate more than half of all our energy. But it has taken 5 planning applications and almost £30,000 in expert fees, and we still don't have planning permission. The rules should make it easy and mandatory to build green homes. Homeowners need high-quality advice that look at retrofitting each property as a whole. And that is hard to find. Who do you trust? The double glazing salesman? There is still no one place where you can go, like a website or a trade body, to find a retrofit coordinator to draw up a plan to retrofit your home step by step as your budget allows. We need to invest in the energy efficiency of every home. With all those billions we're about to spend on caps and tax cuts and rebates, we're just renting our future. We should be investing in it, in insulation and clean heating and renewable energy for every home. It's been said that the best time to plant a tree is years ago. The second best time is now. We'll never regret it, if only we'd done it already.
Thank you, Martina. A call there for a Green Homes programme, some points around funding, a need to mandate low-carbon homes, and clearly there's a need for advice for homeowners emerging from this conversation. Next up, Nicholas.
Brilliant, thank you. Follow that, eh? That was brilliant. Well done, Martina. Yeah. Well, I tried to. She came in. I couldn't stop her. So the subject is greater and greener housing, and we've been given all us panellists a long list of questions here. I'm going to try and answer 3 of them. 1, do we have enough homes? 2, what actually is it to build greater and greener housing? And then 3, what can we do about it? And actually, what I'm going to say is going to touch on some of the points that Brian and Martina and others have said. So first of all, no, just as a statement of fact, we don't have sufficient homes in this country. We've got a homes to households ratio of about 0.99. The average in Europe is about 1.12. And that is even worse when you take account of the fact that our demand is lopsided crudely in the southeast and a few other places. And that's why the market is so tight. And it's even worse than that, because actually the market can never be properly fluid. Because if I'm trying to sell a 2-bedroom flat in Basingstoke and you're trying to buy a 5-bedroom house in Leeds, it's irrelevant. So you've got lots of micro markets. So the tighter it is, the worse. So as a statement of irreducible fact, at the macro level, we don't have enough. So we do have a problem, and as I think we all know, but I think it needs to be said, that is leading to a grotesque loss of opportunity and personal opportunity for the poorer and for the younger. And I speak as someone who's just old enough almost to have escaped that, but I can see people 5, 10, 15 years younger than myself, how their life chance is just getting harder and harder and harder. So I think we have Samuel always corrects me when I use this word in a non-philosophical sense, but I'm going to say it anyway, we have an existential need to have more homes in this country. Yes, yeah, although he doesn't like that, because that's not philosophically correct. He'll tell you what. No, shush. Come in later. He'll correct me later. So that's point 1. But a very, very important point. They're not perhaps the focus of our conversation, but I think needs to be the underpinning. Point 2 is, what is it to build greater and greener homes? Now, quite rightly, and Martina was just doing this brilliantly, there's an enormous focus on the energy in use of a home, and that is very important. So everything I'm going to say is it's as well. Because actually there are 4 or 5 things you need to consider about the energy effectiveness and efficiency of a home. The first is the embodied carbon in making it. And that's about 50, I was about to say 15 by mistake, 50% of the overall energy of a building in its lifetime is how much energy is spent building it, not heating. Now, I realise that's not relevant to the people living in a house today, but it is relevant to us as a society as we think about this. And that has very, very important implications for what we do with our existing stock and also what we build in the future. So if you knock down an inefficient Victorian semi-detached or terraced house and replace it with the most efficient house that you could build, it'll cost you about 100 years of improved energy efficiency to catch up with the carbon you just threw away. The energy embodied in a Victorian house would drive a car about 10 times around the world. But net, we've got to work out how to use our existing stock and make it more efficient, but chucking it all away isn't the right thing to do. And I should say that the materials we use then become incredibly important. And because I can never quite remember the list, I just wrote it out for myself. So aluminium, fiberglass, insulated material and cement are basically the least green materials, with wood basically and organic materials being the most green. Things that you can make naturally from the earth or locally essentially have much lower embodied carbon. So this really matters and is not much talked about because there's no one trying to sell that to people. Then actually what we build, how resilient it is, how long it will last. I mean, outrageously, most buildings are these days built with a guarantee of 20, 30 or 60 years. Homes and buildings being built by civic society, by the public sector, hospitals, schools, in my humble opinion, should be built to last for many hundreds of years because they should not just be energy efficient, but they should actually say to us as a society and as a local society, this is us, this is you, we stand for this is our heart, this is our home, and something that can then talk between the past and the present and into the future. And when you create beautiful buildings, ladies and gentlemen, people find new uses for them. The example I give, which is perhaps a silly one, but I think it's a profound one, is telephone booths. Now, this doesn't go to the heart of our energy efficiency challenges, but as you may all have spotted, we invented these about 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. So all telephone booths are not required anymore, and yet somehow all the ones built before sort of the 1970s have been recycled into other things. They're used as defibrillators, as coffee shops, as local poetry libraries in my little local village. Whereas all the stuff, the K whatever they were called, that were put up in the 1980s have all been chucked away. Power stations are repurposed if they're beautiful. So we need to create places that we will invest in for many, many centuries to come. Third one is biodiversity. Now, you can actually build in a field and increase the biodiversity, and there's enormous potential, I can tell you, it's enormously popular to improve the amount of greening, we call it greening up, within our urban realm. And I can come to some things we can do that. But that's a popular thing to do, which is improves our environmental friendliness. And then finally, is lifestyle and the density and the nature of the places we create. If you build a passive house that you drive to every day, you are not building a passive house. If you build a less efficient house that you can walk around the corner to, you're actually almost certainly building a far more environmentally efficient thing. So how densely we build, and this is not a naive argument for uber density, and to the degree to which you can walk, cycle, use public transport versus needing to use a car every day to do your quotidian errands, then has a big impact. So when we talk about green homes, we actually need to think about all of those things, not just the energy in use. And I say that's not to criticise the focus on energy use, which obviously does have most political and cost of living fraction. So to summarise, because I've probably gone on for too long already, what should we do? Here are 3 or 4 quick ideas, which hopefully will pick up on what Ruth and some of the others were saying. First, and actually, we create streets are working on this now. Is that my quiet, Nicholas? Yeah. Okay.
Shut up.
Yeah, fine. Thanks, Liam.
I said it especially.
Yeah, thank you.
If I could hop on the back of that.
Yeah, okay, no.
I didn't know you had my number.
She obviously does. Yeah. So just 4 quick things. I won't go. I'll perhaps expand them later. One, there is scope, I think, to change power within streets to allow communities and neighbourhoods to green up their streets. It's something that's made very hard at the moment. It should be made easier. 2, we should create places what I call gentle density, which have the advantages of private homes, your own back garden, but some of the advantages of greater density. You can, to some degree, have your cake and eat it on that. 3, where it goes really matters. There's enormous scope to infill existing settlements and extend existing settlements particularly in some of our left behind places. We need to restart the cycle of place quality in some of our left behind towns and cities. That's a hard thing to say, though an easy thing to do. Fourthly, and this again picks up on what both Brian and Martina were saying, we need to change the process, because at the moment the process of building homes, particularly green homes, is enormously development control focused, and it's not, you can't de-risk it up front. So we need to define, and this is something that local communities should do, what good looks like, what good is in terms of its environmental efficiency and where it is. And as long as you're building within that carapace, essentially you can build away in certain places. And that's the only way to allow the small builder and the self-builder and the custom builder to come back into the market. And it's worth saying that we are by far the most concentrated market. So I think all of those things come together, and now I will be quiet because the chair is asking me to. Thank you.
Marvellous. Thank you, Nicholas. I won't summarise that, but I perhaps will mention the existential need for new homes might be something rebutted by Samuel. So, Samuel.
Right, so, I mean, an existential need, I mean, if something's an existential risk, it might destroy the thing. Right. So, the lack of housing isn't clearly an existential risk to the country. The country won't cease to exist if we don't build more. It might be an existential risk to the Conservative Party. So there is considerable reason for people here to be interested in this. And that, I think, is partly why I'm going, unlike the speakers have said wonderful and eloquent things about the question of quality, I'm going to say I think something about quantity instead, mainly about quantity. The issue that really is, has been perhaps too hot to touch. And just a few, you get these amazing lists before these talks. It's like, here's 9 massive questions, each of which you could speak for hours and hours. You cover those, guys. So I just get to choose a sort of random strand of thought that I was thinking about in the last week. So one thing people often say, right, about often kind of mentality you get approaching housing issues is you get people, I call them the tough-minded people. The tough-minded people think they care about quantity, rightly. And because they're tough-minded, they believe we're going to ram this through in the face of the various soft-minded people who don't have the willpower to do this, or who are naysaying in one shape or form. And you've got different kinds of tough-minded people. So, we'll have here some libertarian tough-minded people who think we should build over the green belt or parts of the green belt. You have a certain kind of YIMBY tough-mindedness, the people who want to build loads of high-rise everywhere in cities, give planning permission to everyone to build like the Victorians did, up to 80 foot. You have social housing tough-mindedness. This is probably, left tough-mindedness, less common at Conservative Conference, but common in the housing policy world. We want to go back to the 1950s, where you seize great tracts of the countryside, expel the population, and then master plan these great modernist cities there. Right. Now, the interesting thing about tough-mindedness is pretty much all of this stuff is possible without legislation right now. So the Secretary of State can, through their call-in powers, can permit any development in the country, and if they systematically called in developments and permitted them, essentially they would repeal the 1947 Planning Act, in effect, and you'd have planning free-for-all, much more like we did in the 19th century. They can impose SDO, special development orders, which are like areas where which are exempted from planning. They can do that without prime legislation, without second legislation, even without consultation. They can designate SDOs. They can change the housing need assessments. The government could just, next year, in the housing need assessment, they could say, we need to have 3 million units in London. They've got to do this. If they don't do this, then the local plan there will be invalid. And you couldn't quite do this next year, but you could do this over a few-year cycle. And then they'll just default to national policy. They could build crazy. All these instruments exist already. They're all possible. Why don't they happen? The reason is just because they're politically impossible. It's just because people have not solved for the politics. So, true tough-mindedness about housing, the one question you should all go away and think very hard about when you're dealing with the quantity question on housing, it's all politics. It's not law, it's not economics. All of those are easy. We can all solve those on the back of an envelope in 5 minutes. We can produce magnificent solutions. And in fact, they've all solved already. We've already got buildings that sell for 4 times more than their build cost all across southern England, so the economics just go away. We've already got all these powers in primary legislation that can be exercised. So that's the main, my main take home, right? Just think about solving for politics on quantity. Roughly, what do I think are the sort of useful mechanisms for this? So, as I say, in the south of England, the places which have like acute housing scarcity, we've got this really interesting situation, a situation kind of unique, I mean, actually probably literally unique in the whole history of this country, and unthinkable before the late 20th century, where buildings sell for 4 times more than they cost to build. A fascinating situation that you're in there. So as soon as you grant planning permission on lots of these sites, the value of them goes up enormous. Like sometimes it goes up by sort of 10,000% or something because of it. But, of course, all the neighbours think this is horrible and they don't want to have disruption and change to their neighbourhoods and all the reasons why perfectly rational people oppose development all the time. The mechanisms we've got to think about are ways of sharing that planning gain with the communities who are negatively affected by development, with local people, in such a way that they can be brought into development, that you can win them round so that you can get their consent, and ideally that you can get their championship. And the thing I work on, best known for, some of you will know about, is street votes, where streets can opt in collectively to permissions that will be a huge opportunity to them, but will also create more houses, more gentle density for the country. Another area that the government should be thinking about here is estate regeneration, where you've got relatively low density social housing from the post-war period, and there are ways of doing estate regeneration, so it's an enormous opportunity for all existing residents on the estate, so you can win support of people, so you can win championship from people, and you can create a great many new homes at the same time. Those are just like back sort of thumbnail ideas, but it's that kind of idea that you have to be thinking about. Like, how can you get the people who are currently opposing building near them to support it, and thereby get round some of the terrible political constraints that are indeed a terrible problem for the country and an existential problem for the Conservative Party.
Thank you, Samuel. That's ideas there on how to get people on side. Street votes is perhaps something we can come back to in the Q&A. Over to Liam.
Hello, I'm Liam Halligan. I'm here not because I write columns in the Telegraph as per the rubric and do TV shows and stuff. I'm here because I wrote a book called Home Truths, the UK's chronic housing shortage, why it matters and how to solve it in 2019, and it came out in paperback in 2021. And in that 2021 paperback, Sajid Javid, former Chancellor, obviously former Community Secretary, he wrote a foreword in which he backed the main thrust of the arguments in the book, which were all about the supply side of the housing market, calling for a CMA inquiry into our large house builders. They exhibit all the features of an oligopoly, according to House of Lords report in 2016. They are a cartel, according to somebody called Michael Gove, of this.
Who's he? I remember the name.
Of this parish. In that foreword, which I didn't write myself, well, no, written a little bit. Sajid Javid also backed my call for a reversal of the 1961 Land Compensation Act, which goes to the heart of what Samuel was just talking about. The 1961 Land Compensation Act was where the UK, in a kind of spasm back to feudalism, decided that when land was sold, all the planning gain, which can be thousands of % increases in the value of agricultural land, should go to the landowner, and none of it should go to the community. And the UK is a grotesque outlier around the world in the sense that we do that. In many US states, the planning gain is shared systematically. In Germany, in Holland, Hong Kong, Cowperthwaite economics was built off the back of the sharing of planning gain. Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, many of the most successful countries and most democratic and free countries in the world, they systematically share planning gain. We have a very grubby, very opaque, rather corrupt process called an S106 investigation, in which the large house builders often railroad and shoehorn local councils into dropping any obligations that they have to share planning gain in the form of football pitches, changing rooms for local communities, schools, roads, even children's playgrounds. It's dark and it's corrupt, and the idea of my book was to try and shine a light onto what was going on. So what I'm going to do in the few minutes I've got is I'm just going to mention 5 numbers, because I'm a trained economist who waded into journalism and then the planning debate. The first number is 8.7, and that's a multiple, and that's the cost of the average home compared to the average annual wage in this country, 8.7 times. And if you can only get 3 times on a mortgage and you have no inherited wealth, and there are 2 of you, even before childcare costs, you can't buy the average home if you're on the average wage. And that's why UK home ownership is now below the EU average and falling. We're no longer a nation of homeowners. When I bought my first home in the mid-90s, that number was 4.5. And of course, the 8.7 is an average. In the southeast, it's 12.1. In London, it's 15.4 in our capital city. That is prima facie evidence of a chronic shortage of housing. A shortage of housing which some analysts and think tankers funded by large oligopolistic house builders deny exists. There's a chapter in my book, chapter 6, the no shortage myth. I had to get it heavily lawyered because I was fighting very, very powerful vested interests when I wrote that chapter. The second number is 61%. 61% is the percentage of our homes built each year by the top 10 biggest house builders. I think it's 61% because it's really hard to find out, because the Home Builders Federation, a rather different organisation to the Federation of Master Builders, which Brian represents, doesn't publish the numbers anymore, and when I asked them for them repeatedly, they refused to give them to me. 61% is an oligopoly. When we, at least, in the 70s and 80s, we had many, many small builders building homes. They competed not just on quality, but also on price. They were dad and son organisations that brought in school friends, communities. They built for pride, knowing that the people who lived in the houses they built, they would know them for the rest of their lives. They trained people, they cared. They weren't stock market listed, they weren't bought by private equity companies and then leveraged out of existence almost. 61%, it's far too big. The last time we had a CMA inquiry into our house building industry, an industry which produces the most important thing that anyone ever purchases in their lives, unless they're the super rich, was 2008. The conclusion of that report was lost in the collapse of Lehman and then the journalistic frenzy which followed that. That report was produced by the OFT, as it then was, the Office of Fair Trading, and it said, if housing concentration gets any bigger than it currently is, it's going to be too big. At that point, the top 10 house builders built 35% of housing in this country. I'm a capitalist. I like competition. This is not competition. This is not capitalism. There is no competition. There is a series of local monopolies working in our house building industry. And I've met very few cabinet ministers who have got the guts to admit that and address it. That's my second number. My third number is 1.1 million.
I may need you to accelerate on your notes.
Okay, I will do. 1.1 million is the number of outstanding planning permissions that aren't being used. There are many planning permissions that are given and then sat on. Shelter have written a brilliant report about ghost houses, houses that are never built, because the large house builders are taking planning permissions, preventing smaller builders from getting them, and then sitting them and not using them. If you get a planning permission, there should be an obligation to use it within 2 years, or you lose it and then you're fined. The fourth number is 13%. 13% is the share of England's landmass that's covered by the Greenbelt. The Greenbelt is not being concreted over because it's 1.8 times bigger now than it was in 1979. We can have a discussion about that. But the fact that we've built Crossrail in the southeast, and then we're not allowed to build around those stations, even though we built it with taxpayers' money, is completely mad. And my fifth number is 1967, which isn't a number, it's a year. It's 2 years before I was born, and I'm now in my early 50s. I know I look younger. 1967 was when the charter for Milton Keynes made it into a new town. We haven't been built a single significant settlement in the UK in my lifetime. When I was born, the UK's population was 45 million. It's now 66, 67 million. That is completely mad and points to the fundamental failure of our political class and media class to grapple with this question. And just let me add my little bit, if I may, Chair, to this existential debate. yes, of course, housing, there isn't an existential housing shortage in a philosophical sense, because the houses that exist. On the other hand, I would say lots of people who should exist now currently don't exist because there isn't enough housing. The lack of housing is now whacking our fertility. So many young people can't have families, won't have families, because women getting to 28, 29, the average first child age, 45% of them are now living in rental accommodation, and in the mid-90s, it was 10%. Thank you.
Liam, thank you for shining the spotlight on some of those existing challenges with the housing system, particularly that demographic point at the end. James.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you to Bright Blue for inviting me along. I'm delighted to be working with Bright Blue on their forthcoming report on delivering more homes and getting to net zero. Now, it's a tough gig to follow 7 esteemed and erudite speakers, but I'll give it my best shot. Planning reform is one of the surest ways to deliver economic growth, and the Prime Minister is right that we need to raise the long-term trend rate of growth in this country. But we are also one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. We've lost more of our biodiversity than any other nation in the G7, and we face the real challenge of climate change. And as other panellists have pointed out, we should not be building homes today which will require costly retrofitting in the future. And the decline of the natural environment and the threat from climate change are both a risk to our economic prosperity. So these two objectives, increasing housing supply and environmental improvement, need to go hand in hand, and we need to do them in tandem. And I'd like to set out 3 policies which I think could help us to make progress in doing that. The first is we need to align our planning legislation with the Climate Change Act. That means, for example, the regeneration and the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill currently making its way through Parliament probably should be amended so that planning policy and planning decisions must be consistent with our national carbon budgets and net zero by 2050. Now, this wouldn't just mean that planning systems helping to deliver our climate commitments, it would also enable us to build more homes quickly and efficiently, because it would reduce the number of objections, delays and legal challenges based on the climate sustainability and climate commitments of new developments. So it would bring certainty to the planning system and help us to build homes more quickly, and homes which are compliant with our net zero obligations. The second, and this comes to what Nicholas was talking about around embodied carbon. The government has a plan for operational carbon. There'll be new future home standards coming in 2025, which will deal with energy efficiency and low carbon heating in new homes. We don't yet have a policy for embodied carbon. Now, this as operational carbon falls, embodied carbon becomes a bigger proportion of the carbon footprint of the built environment. It was welcome this week that the government said they're going to bring forward a consultation next year on it's called whole life carbon assessments, basically setting targets for the emissions of a building or development from its inception to its demolition. But both the Environmental Audit Committee and industry are asking for the government to move faster, and one way of doing that would be to write embodied carbon reporting and ultimately limits into building regulations, known as Part Z. It's an amendment to building regulations which has got widespread support across industry, and that's something the government could pick up and run with, and it's something that MPs in the Conservative Environment Network Parliamentary Caucus have been calling for, and one of them actually has a private members bill, to that effect. Finally, my third point is around, and again, other panelists have touched on this, the idea of incentivising urban intensification. Restrictive urban planning rules prevent development close to amenities and sustainable transport links. That drives unpopular greenfield development elsewhere, and it locks in car dependency. This drives climate change. It also drives other environmental harms like air pollution and biodiversity loss. So actually, I think the investment zones that the Prime Minister and the government are bringing forward could actually deliver not just economic benefits, but environmental benefits too, if they are geographically specific and focused in urban centres and on areas of brownfield regeneration. But there has been some controversy over the past week around the weakening of environmental protections in these areas, and that has led to a backlash from environmental groups, and it's putting the whole planning reform at risk, and it risks the political consensus which Samuel spoke so eloquently about. So I think habitat regulation reform, now this is an EU directive, a legacy EU directive which protects our internationally designated habitats and species, some of the most valuable natural assets we have in this country. But reform of the habitats regulations has been coming for a while because it adds often quite unnecessary cost and delay to the planning system. But it's got to be done in a way which not only delivers faster planning consent, but also better outcomes for our protected sites and species. I think there's two broad ways you can do this, and the government have been working on this. One is around streamlining and consolidation. At the moment, we have a collection of European designations and domestic national designations. Those should be amalgamated and consolidated, and that would reduce the number of assessments for the developers have to go through. And the second part is we need to deal with the other primary pressures which are causing harm to our protected sites and are the reason that many of them are in unfavourable condition. That means pollution from agriculture, from wastewater treatment works, and from poorly built development. I think if we did those two things, we could find a middle way through here which delivers the investment zones which the government wants and which can deliver huge economic and, I think, environmental benefits, and continues to protect our most important sites and species as the wildlife NGOs quite rightly want. So, in summary, I think reforming habitat regulations, dealing with embodied carbon, and aligning planning legislation with the Climate Change Act could go some way to tackling the challenge that we're talking about today.
Thank you for rounding off the speeches there, James. I'm conscious of time, so I'm minded to go straight to the floor for questions. In doing so, could I ask you to say your name and where you're from? Keep your questions concise, if I may. And also, given that we have 7 panellists, could you give an indication of who you might like to ask the question? I won't ask all 7 of us to comment on every question. So, starting with the lady at the front here and the gentleman to her right.
Thank you. Councillor Janet Clowes, Conservative Group Leader at Cheshire East Council, the second largest local authority in the North West. What are we going to do about rural homes? We have a historic housing legacy and we do not have public transport. If we're talking about carbon capture and carbon load on our houses, we need to focus on those rural houses. We did get a grant from government. It was quite significant. It was £1.3 million. It has enabled us to retrofit just 113 houses. So we need to think about that quite clearly. And biodiversity net gain, we need to give our planning officers increased powers to make sure that that net gain is achieved in the areas where the developments are taking place, where we are losing the biodiversity, not on the other side of the borough, 30 odd miles away. So please could you take that to whoever you're talking to and bring that forward. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman to your right.
Thanks. Thank you. I'm Jeremy Hopwood. I'm a constituent. I'm interested in the political process. I find it frustrating because building on the comments that many of the panel have made, we're raising issues. We're coming up with some brilliant solutions, but it begs the question. I mean, these have been going on for years. I mean, we've known what these problems are for years, like several other, political issues. So what is it about the governmental process that has us either not solve them, in other words, choose not to solve them, or come up with policies that patently don't work, or come up with policies like Brian alluded to, the green home scheme, a great scheme, except that it was lasting for 6-9 months, and then on again, off again, no incentive to invest. So essentially shooting it in the foot. So I think it's really probably for Ruth primarily because you're in the political system. Maybe you have some insight into what is it about the system that has us still talking about this years later than Liam must have been researching his book, because if we don't solve that problem, we're going to be back next year saying
Indeed.
the same things.
Okay. Thank you very much. Rural homes. Did any of our panellists want to come in on that one to start with?
It was on the retrofit, really, wasn't the question?
The
And
historic,
supply
yeah,
as
and
well.
the supply as well.
Both.
No.
I think you're absolutely right to identify the need for more rural homes, and I would say actually that's where local house builders should be part of that organic growth of our villages. Villages need to be part of a living countryside, and if you had local builders providing better designed houses, not in huge amounts but small organic growth, I think it would be more favourable to communities that may be not wanting huge developments on the edge of their towns and villages.
Ruth, did you?
help the houses that are already there.
In terms of what? In terms of oh yes, well if you're talking about retrofit, I was talking about supply. If you're talking about retrofit, then I think my solution would be to treat retrofit as a infrastructure project. We've got 19 million homes plus that need to be retrofitted. That's a major exercise which can't be done in a lifetime of one parliament, which is why we have that problem about piecemeal approach coming and going. It's got to be a long-term approach to transform our housing stock.
Ruth, did you want to comment on the question around how do we get out of this cycle?
Yeah, sure. So why do projects like this fail? I think short-termist thinking. I think not working things out properly with stakeholders. So if we take the Green Homes Grant, for example, one aspect of that was really successful, and that was the aspect that we delivered through local authorities to social housing, and that has actually been successful. The element of it focused on private homes didn't work, partly because of the very short time frame for the actual scheme. So there weren't enough traders registered to meet the demand. The electronic system to administer the scheme wasn't set up properly, and there were too many people not registered on it. It was very sort of getting through that was pretty burdensome. From the point of view of the firms who are actually delivering this retrofit, well, if you're only going to have this scheme for 6 to 9 months, why are you taking on new staff and training them? Because it's not really worth your while doing it. And I think when we'd seen previous schemes like this fail as well, the other aspect is because the upfront costs are too high, and the length of time it takes to see a return on your investment is way too long, and that's why I think we need to think about doing it a bit differently, and I think those are some of the issues that need to be addressed for any future offerings.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, but it still begs the question, why?
Okay, and Nick, do you want to comment?
Come very quickly on that? I mean, I think we've got into a sort of category error over many years. I mean, the previous panel, I said something similar, so I'll be very quick. We regulate the way in which we create homes in this country very oddly. Not just in the way we impose the tax on it, the betterment tax, i.e. randomly through discussion rather than as a fixed tariff, but also in fact where the power is. So if you compare, and I'm afraid for my sins I have, if you compare our local policies about what we can and can't do, it is a verbal document that is unclear and which is then left up to lawyers to discuss how you get there. If you look at comparable documents in Holland or France, in much though not all of the states, or in Portugal or in Spain, blah, 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 actually it's much more clearly regulated. Now, when you have nationalised the right to develop a house, which we have, and you then have an unclear regulatory ask about what you can or can't do, that is at least a systematic failure. And the problem we've really got into, to finally answer your question, is on the right, crudely we thought, rules, regulations, bad thing, and so they strip away at that, forgetting that you've nationalised the right to develop. So actually, if you're going to nationalise development rights, but then be unclear as to what you'll say yes to, that is an absolute cauldron of problems. If you're on the left, people have defended planning, but not realising they're actually defending a bad system of planning, where all the power goes at the end of the process, which leads to an oligopoly of large firms. So oddly, I think both the left and the right, for almost opposite reasons, have sort of defended the status quo, whilst they're being very rude about it.
Liam.
Very briefly, Chair. So in my book, I developed this concept of the iron triangle of vested interests, which is maintaining the status quo, which is deeply non-beneficial for ordinary people trying to buy a home. So the triangle is, on the one hand, you've got the big house builders, the oligopolistic house builders, who are making a 30 to 35% margin on an object that uses basically Victorian technology. They're not tech giants or coders or They're builders. They should be making like a 5 or 8% margin max. The second corner of the iron triangle of vested interest are existing homeowners who, of course, they don't talk about it, but they like the fact that there aren't enough homes because that increases their net worth. And the third triangle, part of the triangle, are the banks. 70% of all loans in this country are linked to residential property. Banks keep telling Treasury ministers that if we build more homes and house prices level out or fall and become more affordable, then there'll be another banking crisis, which is complete nonsense, but successive ministers nearly always fall for it. The political geometry is shifting. This party is meant to be the party of homeowners. Well, there aren't that many homeowners, and there aren't that many homeowners, particularly among the 25 to 34-year-olds, who are less likely now to own homes than any time since the 1930s, even though they're paying more for their housing in terms of their rent or mortgages if they've got them, than any decade since the 1930s. So if the Conservative Party wants to exist properly in 15 to 20 years' time, it simply must solve this problem. The party that solves the problem of housing in this country, not just among aspiring buyers, but also at the social end. We haven't talked about social housing, the chronic shortage of social housing as well. The party that solves this problem will be the party that wins lots of elections in a row and will deserve to. Corbyn came within 10,000 votes of winning in 2016. If you'd have spread 10,000 votes across various constituencies, he would have won. And a lot of people that voted for him were young people who were sick and tired of doing the right thing, and they're not even being able to buy a home, and so they wanted to throw the cards up in the air and see what happened. The Help to Buy scheme was grotesque. All the benefits went to the big builders. It's been badly run, and those who don't get access to it, they just end up with even more expensive homes because Help to Buy juiced up prices, particularly of increasingly substandard new builds. I'll stop there, but I could say a lot more.
Cut you off in full play there, but I want to go to more questions. So I think gentleman at the front here, gentleman in the middle, and lady at the front here. I'll take three in one go. Yep. Please do say, obviously, who you are and where you're from.
Hi, I'm that working. Hi, I'm Darren Brewer. I'm a small developer based in the South Coast. I think it's quite interesting what you guys are talking about, but interestingly, high streets and regeneration of high streets, I haven't seemed to have been coming into any conversation tonight. I know obviously it's a conversation moving forward. I think what we see, I generate all high streets around the South Coast, we'll try to. Planning is a nightmare. Unfortunately, planning officers seem to have their own remit. They don't seem to follow policy. It's just whether they like it or not, and if they don't like it, it's down to the inspectorate, and then we have a problem of we have a delay, and then we have.
You for a question,
no, it's fine. What I would like to ask the panel is simplifying planning and maybe making regional planning departments a far better way forward to getting housing building started, rather than have various departments in local authorities all having a different remit.
Okay, regional question there. Gentleman at the back.
Thank you. I'm Councillor Joe Robertson. I'm Group Leader on the Isle of Wight Council in opposition. So I've got to leave conference early this year because we have a vote on whether to adopt an island planning strategy, so a document with a 15-year land supply in it. And among the many issues with it is that some developers, local developers, are also advisors to the planning officers about which sites to include in the strategy. And it's unsurprising that a lot of sites that they own or have an option over are included in the draft strategy. And as far as I'm aware, the list of those advisors is not in the public domain, or if it is, it's certainly not in the public consciousness. Is there anyone who's willing to defend that as a good system?
Okay, fair enough. Next question. Thank you. Lady at the front there.
Hi, I'm Leslie Rudd. I'm Chief Executive at Electrical Safety First, a charity who, I guess, does what it says on the tin, focuses on electrical safety. And I just wanted to say, first of all, quite interested to hear what people's views are on safety, because it hasn't been mentioned at all, which is a bit disappointing in a housing debate. So I just wanted to say that if we could perhaps put a bit more focus on that, particularly as we're going to net zero. And a question really, one of the things that we have, we've got an energy crisis, we've got vulnerable people. The Priority Services Register gives free gas safety checks for vulnerable people. There's no such thing for electrical safety. And really, this is the type of thing, that we're behind. We're becoming net zero. We're becoming an electric society, but the regulations and standards and things haven't kept up.
Excellent.
So I just wanted to say, can we have more focus on that? And do people support vulnerable people having electrical safety checks, not just gas? They won't have gas for much longer.
Okay, thank you. So very important call there for the conversation to cover safety. Developers advising the planning officers and the high street and whether regional planning is something we should, I think, go back to. I'm not sure about that. Who would like to take that? Martina, would you like to comment on perhaps the safety side of things?
I think...
Or Brian, you
I'm happy to. I've written extensively about the cladding scandal, which is all about sky safety. Yes, I mean, that's a very important point. I think you're quite right that people don't think about that when you talk about, electrifying all our homes. So what the cladding scandal showed us is that when you bring in this kind of idea of insulating tower blocks, and you don't regulate that properly, you end up with a really, really big problem. So we need to be careful with when we do the same to homes and we electrify them and we insulate them more, that we don't end up making a really big problem for ourselves down the line in the same way.
Brian, did you want to comment on?
Well, I was just thinking, actually, in terms of retrofitting our existing housing stock, that seems to be a good opportunity. And the concept of the building passport for each home, why not put that sort of electrical safety into that? That would be, we do it over many years, but it means that every home gets looked at. So I think that would tackle that problem.
I don't suppose anyone is willing to defend the developers advising the planning officers.
Let me say one thing about that. I mean, so obviously I'm not going to defend. And actually, I've come across, I won't name names, but I've come across examples of this in research. I've been astonished by some of the practices that go on in the allocation system. You would not believe that in our country this stuff goes on, and goes on, if not quite in broad daylight, then strikingly close to it. Right, it's a lot of this stuff's kind of all the worst scandals. They're kind of just taking the information's sort of almost there in the public domain. Or one of the things in the background here, right, is not only do we not build enough homes in this country, but we do build them in very weird places, and that happens on a national level. Everyone blames local authorities for not building enough. Most local authorities either meet their targets from the government or come very close to meeting them. Large majority. So one weird thing about our national targets is they're distributed in strange places. So like some bits of the country that are adding the most homes relative to the existing housing stock, like I think Northumberland is doing amazing work on this. Northumberland doesn't have the same kind of housing scarcity as London does. It's got scarcity of certain tenure types, scarcity of certain kinds of homes, but London doing far worse than Northumberland. And that has to do with the kind of targets that the government sets nationally. And then you get the same thing playing out at the local level when this poor local authority is forced, who's going to take the pain on this? They've got a job that no politician ever wants to have of distributing this incredibly unpopular thing, housing, for which local people get no sufficient benefit to justify them for the inconvenience that happens near to them. And they've got all these people trying to influence them in more or less illicit ways. And no wonder we get pretty weird stuff happening. So you can find villages outside Leicester which have added 20, 30% to their housing stock in the last 10 years. Why have we chosen villages outside Leicester to take the hit on this? Well, the answer is because these communities are not politically strong enough to defend themselves from it, whereas communities that are politically better resourced, huge areas of London, enjoy a luxury of defence against development that they don't like. So that's, in the background to your question there, was one of the deep malaises of the system, and one of the most important things for us to be thinking about.
Can I just ask, is it normal Is it normal in your experience or anyone's experience for planning officers to be advising, for developers to be advising planning officers when working up a land supply strategy?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And it's because planning departments have so few resources. But if there was systemic sharing of planning gain rather than the dogfight of S106 and SIL, which often doesn't happen, and it's all being changed now anyway, other countries share planning gain 50-50. Then you'd have huge amounts of money to build schools, bypasses. The local politics of planning would be revolutionised, because then a lot of people who quite rationally don't want the aggro of house building near them, if they don't get anything in return, would think, oh, maybe my property will go up because I'll live in more of a place, because there'll be money to actually build stuff. And also a slither of that money could go to properly resourcing planning departments. So again, the land agents and the big builders in my research don't pinch all the really good people in the planning departments and give them, you know, massive jobs that the public sector can't match.
I think we'll go for, we've got 3 minutes left, so I'm going to take 2 questions. Gentleman in the middle there with the tie, and gentleman over here as well.
Thank you. Richard Clare, Leader, Wiltshire Council. I'm retrofitting all my council housing stock to an EPCB, 10,000 a unit. I'm building 1,000 new council houses, net zero, about 4% above normal build cost. Yet the 2,400 houses built in Wiltshire last year, to retrofit them to net zero is going to cost £48 million. So 2 questions. Firstly, why on earth is government still letting this happen? Flip that switch on the large developers, they'll suddenly give the economies of scale to let the rest of us start retrofitting more cheaply. Then on the micro level, I would love to be building more houses in my small villages. Yet, I'd love 10 units in each, give me 4 affordable houses in each one. Yet, I am told, because of sustainability embedded into this desire to stop us all driving, and in rural areas we've got to drive, I'm afraid, it's non-sustainable and a planning inspector will simply not let us do it. How are we going to overcome this to let each area build what we need instead of this,
Okay,
I don't know, Stalinist approach?
Thank you very much. And gentleman over here. It'll have to be a very quick question, I'm afraid.
So the private rented sector contains some of the most difficult to retrofit properties. It's got a lot of people living in it. How do you balance the very valid need to get an EPC by 2025 and not lose those homes and create another problem?
Okay, thank you. Brian, do you mind if I direct those retrofitting questions to you in the first instance?
About the last question, you mean,
or either
all
of them.
Yep.
Well,
well,
you should pick your favourite, and I'll pass the next one on.
Yes, I mean, you're quite right. It's a nonsense to be building homes that have to be retrofitted. That's clearly not right, and it's a complete waste of resources and doesn't help anyone. With regard to villages, you know, my belief is actually development should be more organic, and that's why local house builders should be part of their community. You know who's building the homes. They have a reputation in their communities. We want to see more of that because I think you would get less opposition from communities about building new homes and greater variety of design. I think that's so important. As I said at the beginning, our country's built a very rich heritage of our homes going back to medieval times. We're in danger of losing that. And then the PRS, you're quite right. I mean, there's a danger. A lot of landlords have come out of the market because of other factors affecting the taxation. There is the requirement to bring it up to EPC by 2025, existing tenants to 28. I think the government needs to be very careful because there's no incentives there, and that's a real danger, which goes back to my national retrofit strategy, but having a clear long-term policy. Otherwise, I think you'll see a further decline in the PRS.
Thank you very much, Brian. I think actually on your comment on the national retrofit strategy, we will actually have to leave it there because we are a minute over. So that brings us to the end of our discussion today. Thank you very much to our panellists. If you'd like to know more about Bright Blue or become a member, do sign up with the team at the back. We're offering membership for just £10 if you join during party conference. We've got 32 events going on this conference, so do check out that on the flyers on your chairs. Our next event is our drink tank, so join us over in Hall 8 at 8:30 p.m. That's in the ICC. So finally, thank you very much to our panellists, to the European Climate Foundation and our guests for your contributions as well. Thanks very much.